Hello, good evening, and welcome to the IWM Lectures for 2024. This is, of course, the first of 3 lectures in this prestigious series, which we began in the year 2000, a significant event that, as it happened, marked the 100th birthday, 2 years before his death, of Hans-Georg Gadamer, a staunch supporter of the IWM since the very beginning in 1982. The series has already been graced by the presence of distinguished scholars as varied and talented as Paul Ricoeur, Zygmunt Bauman, Dipesh Chakrabarti, Eva Illus, and last year, of course, Sheila Ben Habib. Now this year, the IWM and I personally, we are particularly honored to welcome Maria Todorova as the speaker in this year's IWM Lectures in Human Sciences, under the title, The Balkans Mission Possible, an unusually optimistic title, I thought, for the subject, but entirely appropriate. Now, we cooperate in these lectures with 3 departments of Vienna University: the Institute for Social and Cultural Anthropology, the Institute for Political Sciences, and of course, Research Center for the History of Transformations. Maria Todorova is a professor emerita at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign and is widely regarded as one of the most distinguished experts in Southeastern Europe history and Balkan studies. I would actually go further than that, because her seminal book, first published in 1997 but since republished and added to Imagining the Balkans, has become a staple of university curricula worldwide, but not just that. It has become the lodestar of Balkan studies and of understanding Balkan history, which many of us have benefited from. I was very fortunate that the book was published 2 years before my own modern history of the Balkans, and as a consequence, I was able to remove some infelicities which had otherwise crept in once I understood the force of Maria's argument. So, as I say, this is not just an institutional welcome, but a personal welcome to Maria. After she has given her lecture, I will have a short conversation with her before throwing it out to the audience, and then after questions, if you wish to stay for a glass of wine or water, you're most welcome. But before then, Maria.
Thank you, Misha. This is more than generous. It goes downhill from there. But so I'm deeply honored, of course, by the invitation to deliver these IWM lectures that were inaugurated in honor of Hans-Georg Gadamer. And Gadamer is, of course, the excuse and counterbalance to the indecent borrowing of my titles from Mission Impossible, the Tom Cruise film series. As I said in my description, at my age I cannot perform his physical stunts, but I do have my stunts, making the mission possible. But Gadamer is there. Closest to my heart is his elegant and spirited defense of humanities and their practitioners, what he called the Schwatzprofessoren, the chattering class. His father used to call them that, as well as the physiologist mother. He's there also with his insights on tradition, prejudice, experience, understanding, dialogue, negotiation, reciprocity, situatedness, and above all, the complex notion of historical horizon. In fact, I'm grateful to the IWM for the impetus that forced me to read Gadamer. Gadamer has, of course, his own very broad horizons on some very limited, narrowly understood classical traditions, but he inspired me to ascend my mountaintop and look at the Balkans as a unit of meaning through my own shifting horizons and attempt this cherished fusion. These lectures and the book that follows attempt to take stock of my own shifting horizons as I have both experienced but also contemplated the Balkans in these past 3 decades. It can be read as a companion piece to Imagining the Balkans 3 decades later. Accordingly, it consists of 3 parts. The first traces the beginnings of the Balkans and its fading, the fallout from it, by trying to address some of the omissions and insights coming over the span of several decades, and particularly the pertinence of the category race. It argues that the Balkans have a transient lifespan and follows the vicissitudes of their dynamic history in the course of several centuries, from their appearance to the foreseeable cessation as a geopolitical construct to their legacy as signifier. The second seeks to describe the different approaches of measurement, the dead reckoning, that aim to reach this moving object, the Balkans, from specialization to the institutionalization of the discipline, as well as the dominant trends that have shaped it. It focuses on the question of applicability of post and decoloniality as the most recent additions to Balkan epistemology. The third part shifts the perspective drastically to focus on individuals. By presenting several biographies of several relatively unknown individuals from the rogue nation, the third part, it highlights the power and pitfalls of framing. So here comes the first lecture. What country, friends, is this? Asks Viola in Twelfth Night when she falls out in the sea and is washed on the shore after the shipwreck. This is Illyria, lady. Shakespeare wrote his play in 1602 when Illyria was a real place, not the coast of Bohemia or the Ruritania of the Gothic imagination. Its main city, Ragusa or Dubrovnik, was still active and flourishing, although at the tail end of greatness. It was a wealthy place, a true contact zone of languages, religions, and political alliances. It did not have a duke name Orsino. It was a maritime republic, but British imagination is incurably linked to the maritime monarchy. There is an interesting reading of Twelfth Night as a story of displacement, dislocation, exile, and forced migration. In most other Shakespearean comedies, Midsummer Night's Dream, The Merchant of Venice, As You Like It, The Winter's Tale, what Northrop Frye has called the green world plays, the action begins in the real, bleak world, then transfers into the green world, achieves a comic transfiguration, and returns to the normal world. But this is not the case in Twelfth Night. The twins Viola and Sebastian reach Illyria and settle there, never to leave. The world from where they came is unknown, but they end up not in metaphorical green world from where they would return, but in a real world where they enter with assumed names, but eventually reach a place of recognition and stability through marriage. As Emma Smith aptly remarks, rather than finding a green world, Sebastian gets a green card. It might be perhaps too far-fetched to see the twins as part of the expelled Jewish migration to the Ottoman Empire, which took place in the previous century, but it will be fair to say that they had taken the Balkan route, only this time from west to east rather than from east to west. People today think of Dubrovnik as a picturesque tourist destination or link it to the bombing during the Yugoslav wars, but at the time Viola landed, it was still a thriving thalassocracy. It ruled itself as a free republic with a modern, for the time, institutional system, was the great rival of Venice and a tributary of the Ottoman Sultan from the 15th century on, something that gave it unprecedented monopoly over Balkan and Black Sea trade. A century after Viola, one of those Ragusan merchants active in the Ottoman Empire, Nikola Bošković, had his 7th child with his Italian wife. Ruđer Josip Bošković was a precocious child, received an excellent Jesuit education, becoming a Jesuit priest, and was a leading authority in as diverse fields as mathematics, physics, astronomy, meteorology, optics, geodesy, philosophy, theology, in addition to being a successful diplomat and poet. Considered to be the precursor of atomic theory, he was celebrated as one of the major figures of the European Enlightenment. It is only in the age of nationalism that he began to be claimed by Croats, Italians, and even Serbs. And Werner Heisenberg in the 1930s, although complimentary to his great achievements, had to rate him by a German measure, the Croatian Leibniz. In 1761, Bošković was invited by the Royal Society to observe the transit of Venus across the sun in Istanbul. The following year, he traveled back in the retinue of the British ambassador. Passing through Bulgaria and Moldavia, he reached Poland and then returned south to Italy. In his diary, he described the crossing of the Balkans, the Balkan mountains, which he mentioned as one of the names of the mountain range. Travelers in those days preferred the ancient designation Hemus, indicating that the locals used Balkan, literally meaning mountain in Turkish, or Stara planina, the old mountain. It took another whole century after Bošković's voyage before the name spread from the mountain to the peninsula, and another few decades before it received a political connotation with the appearance of the small sovereign Balkan states seceding from what was once Turkey in Europe. At the time, the designation acquired a pejorative meaning, triggered by the disintegration of the empire into weak, economically backward and dependent nation states. Their slow and painful modernization and the accompanying excesses of nationalism created the image of the Balkans as aggressive, intolerant, barbarian, semi-developed, semi-oriental, semi-civilized. To paraphrase E.P. Thompson's famous clip about the working class being present at its own making, the Balkans, that is the people who consider themselves inhabitants of the Balkans, were present at their designation, their discovery, and their denigration. I will also argue that they are equally present in their renaming, disintegration, and continuing opprobrium. Without replaying the music I've been broadcasting this past over 3 decades since the publication of Imagining the Balkans, let me briefly stress several points I deem worth repeating. The term Balkan has a number of manifestations that can be grouped into 3 categories: a name, a metaphor, and a category of analysis. As its simplest, it is a name, a Turkish word meaning mountain. It entered the peninsula with the arrival of the Ottomans. Balkans became one of the names of the region as Balkan Halp Island, only in the 19th century, alongside the names used so far: Hellenic, Dardanian, Roman, Byzantine, Thracian, South Slavic, Greek, Oriental, European, Levant, Turkey in Europe, and so on. By the end of the century, Balkan had gained currency and ascendancy over the earlier ones and began to be increasingly used with a political connotation, referring to the countries seceding from the Ottoman Empire: Greece, Serbia, Montenegro, Romania, Bulgaria, Albania. The political connotation paralleled the rise of nationalism and the retreat of the Ottomans, becoming a problem for the European balance of power. By the turn of the 20th century, especially with the struggle over Macedonia, the ferociousness of the fights and the incompatible programs of the protagonists leading to the Balkan Wars, the viciousness of their internal politics, coupled with the weakening of the Ottomans and the end of the Eastern question, with the end of their empire, the problems became known as the Balkan question. Secondly, Balkans is employed as metaphor. By the beginning of the 20th century, it became a pejorative, a symbol for an array of negative stereotypes. Although of relatively recent origins, they stepped on a deeper layer of opposition between Catholicism and Orthodoxy, Europe and Asia, West and East, but especially Christianity and Islam. However, violence as its leitmotif was, strictly speaking, a post-Balkan Wars phenomenon, when a thoroughly negative value was conclusively sealed to the Balkans. The cruelties of these wars, in a European climate which believed in the stability of the Belle Époque, gave rise to stereotypical images of a particularly harsh and savage region. These persisted, no matter that European barbarities largely outnumbered and outdid Balkan atrocities during the First World War, not to speak of the Second World War. So enduring are these stereotypes that the assassination of Franz Duke Ferdinand in Sarajevo is still often evoked as the principal reason for the global imperialistic conflagration. Accordingly, the sobriquet powder keg of Europe, coined at that time, can still be heard. The term Balkanization, the most important metaphoric notion deriving from Balkan, appeared as a result of the First World War. It is used to denote the process of nationalist fragmentation of larger former geographic and political units into new and problematically viable small states, but was not created in the course of the century when the Balkan states seceded from the Ottoman Empire. Rather, the falling apart of the Austro-Hungarian and Russian empires and the emergence of Poland, Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Latvia, Estonia, and Lithuania resembled the previous disintegration of the Ottoman Empire, and the term Balkanization, employed as comparison, entered the political vocabulary, defined as, I quote, the creation in a region of hopelessly mixed races, of a medley of small states with more or less backward populations, economically and financially weak, covetous, intriguing, afraid, a continuous prey to the machinations of the great powers and to the violent promptings of their own passions. It is the trope of the hopelessly mixed races that deserves special attention. The interwar period added yet another article which had seasoned in the 19th century European thinking, the racial one. A distinctive feature of modern racism was the continued transition from science to aesthetics, with beauty based on an immutable classical ideal, and became identical with the middle class of white Europeans. As a rule, it was based on racial purity. The Balkans, the classical territory of antiquity, were a double disappointment. Not only did they breathe havoc, but the classical stereotype was nowhere to be seen. The racial verdict began with a more open rendering of the formerly subdued and not judgmental motive of racial mixture. What in the 19th century were almost neutral renderings of their ethnic and religious complexity, evoking only an occasional characterization as strange nationalities, now produced feelings of impurity and revulsion over the repellent crossbreeds. Interwar biological racism was a fairly short-lived phenomenon, culminating in Nazi atrocities in Greece and Yugoslavia, but the ethnic diversity of the region has hardly achieved the status of celebrated multiculturality. And yet, the racial component offers a more complex analysis. On the one hand, there is a whole trope about the mongrel nature of the Balkans. The complex ethnic makeup, which added the word Macedon to, of course, to the vocabulary of many writers, was held responsible for the instability and disorder in the peninsula, which was diagnosed as afflicted by the handicap of heterogeneity. On the other hand, despite the presence of racial in the sense of ethnic ambiguity, in the final analysis, the Balkans were still treated as positioned on this side of the fundamental opposition, white versus colored, Indo-European versus the rest. That brings me to race as a category of analysis. Race has become lately a leading category, and there has been critique about the resistance over the employment in the Balkans, to a great extent linked to my work. So let me first deal with the easy part, self-defense. I have been accused that in my theoretical register, race is outside the Balkans, while inside the Balkans, societies supposedly consist only of single-race ethnicities. I hardly would claim such nonsense. I have never asserted that race relations should be excluded from Balkan studies. I've never denied that racism exists in the Balkans, although, and this is entirely correct, I've never made it a central object of my research. But when I was writing in the 1990s, as well as today, what struck me always was that much as people in the east of Europe were perceived as not quite civilized, not quite European, journalists were always impressed by appearance, both in the concentration camps among Bosnian Muslims, as well as today's Ukrainian refugees. European people with blue eyes and blonde hair being killed. This is not Iraq and Afghanistan. I did say that the Balkans are perceived and self-perceived as white and predominantly Christian. But the whiteness includes also Turks and many other Balkan Muslims, Bosnians, Albanians, Pomaks, and so on. I also explained why this is important, as it provides license against accusations of Western racial and religious bias. True, the attitude toward the Roma falls definitively under the rubric of abject, very often biological racism. It is also true that the new geopolitical paradigm effectuates a shift in the Balkans from the bridge between West and East to the wall against the East. And in the course of this, they are displaying classical racist attitudes toward refugees, as well as internal others, specifically the Roma. The question is when. I'm a historian, so when for me is very important. When did this shifting geopolitical paradigm take place? It is certainly with us from the late 20th century, and especially in the last decades, after the Balkans were subsumed within the institutional structure of the European Union and are being relegated to the role of a border outpost of the Fortress Europa. But I was looking deeper into history. All I claimed in imagining the Balkans was that race as an analytical category was not central to Western patterns of perception as they developed from the 15th to the early 20th century, when they crystallized in the Balkanist discourse, unlike analogous attitudes toward Africa, Asia, or the Middle East. And I still stand by this claim. So I'm open to speak about race. Definitions hover between narrow, geopolitically bound ones and broader, more generalized ones. A consensus exists that the concept originated in the early 18th century with the classification of Linnaeus into dividing the human genus in 4 types, which of course corresponded to the 4 ancient humors, and being based on an earlier history of blackness from antiquity. The final transformation of race into a scientific form occurred in the 19th century. David Goldberg insists on distinguishing racism in the plural, depending on their different context and geopolitical region, and speaks of Americanization, South Africanization, Latin Americanization, Palestinianization, and Asianization as some of the modalities of racisms. He has been especially eloquent in showing how racial Europeanization, by making the Holocaust the defining event par excellence, the referent point for race, has disavowed and comfortably raised its colonial legacy and history. This concerns especially the present-day dimension of the racialized figure of the Muslim, and Kohlberg dismisses racialization as an ambiguous and often vacuous notion, suggesting simply race-inflected social situations. Contrastingly, Loïc Vacan, for him, racialization is the central vector. He called for a comprehensive analytic capable of capturing the simultaneous malleability of obdurateness of racial divisions, and produced a compelling, to me, model. He argues against the grain, challenging the belief that ethnicity is fundamentally different from race, and rolling the categories of ethnicity, race, and nationalism under a general new Bourdieusian theory of symbolic power and group making, encompassing class, gender, race, sexuality, religion, and all these other categories. For him, race is a paradoxical subgroup of ethnicity founded on the accident of history. His argumentation is based on the principal distinction between ethnicity and its subtype race, which are predicated on perception and discernment from other determinants, like, for example, which have material base. For example, age, biological life, class, production, gender, mode of reproduction, and so on and so forth. So for him, racial phenomenology is an integral part to racial reality in a way that it is not true of other bases of stratification. Put differently, race is a pure modality of symbolic violence and bending of social reality to fit a mental map of reality. Visually, I'm sorry not to be able to show you that, but he deploys a scheme in which the diagonal of racialization runs from a positive identification of thin and positive ethnicity, based on culture and history at the top, down to a negative or thick or rigid permanent categorization based on nature. As he notes, this is only a Weberian ideal type, but it provides the means for traveling across the span of historical cases and fostering rigorous comparisons. Position and movement along the diagonal of racialization is explained by material and symbolic struggles over the positioning of social space and the naming of populations in which the paramount symbolic powers, the state, law, science, religion, and party politics, compete for the monopoly over the legitimate means of symbolic violence. For me, the great value of Vacan model lies in the fact that it gives an explanation for the historic use of race, applied before the 20th century, and even sometimes today, in an innocent way, to loose group of humans, like family, tribe, close nation, to later deterministic biological understandings. I recently saw Perry Anderson speak of Croats and Romanians and lesser breeds and races under Magyar rule. So it can be innocent. At the same time, by introducing the gradational continuum, it takes account of the historical changes and transformations down, but also up the racialization diagonal. It solves for me the conundrum of Max Weber's rejection of biological race, yet his deployment of a deeply racist attitude toward Poles based on cultural and political factors. Both Goldberg, oh yes, thank you so much. I was just thinking how to unwind this. Both Goldberg and Vacan warn against holding the American debate on race as a golden standard. Goldberg is careful to speak only of Western Europe, where the babble of French, Spanish, English, Dutch, and Portuguese speakers clearly indicates the contours of the former colonial empires and insists on the local specificities within Europe. Yet the denial of race, except for anti-Semitism, is not only a West European feature. It is equally typical for Eastern Europe, and this, together with the hegemonic imposition of the US parameters of the debate on race, accounts for the resistance to adopt critical race theory. In what is today the most important monograph on race in the Balkans, specifically Yugoslavia, Catherine Baker looks through the lens of race to uncover the hierarchies of Europeanness, whiteness, as well as modernity. For her, racialization is a central category, but she is adamant that race has to be highlighted and should not be conflated with ethnicity. The racial conceptualism of East European studies lies, according to Baker, partly in the region's historical experience of waging national liberation struggles against empires, in which its populations saw themselves among imperialism's victims rather than its agents. The lack of one's own imperial or colonial past, and therefore no reason for historical accountability, as well as having the reputation of being historical white nations without the influx of post-colonial migrations until recently. To this, she adds the fallacy of conflating race with ethnicity on the one hand, while defining Eastern Europe as a space whose identities are defined by ethnicity rather than race on the other. Indeed, it is true that Balkan scholarship, ethnicity and nationalism are such dominant categories, completely overshadowing race, that understandably, Balkans' model has been perceived by a lot of East Europeanists and Balkanists as strengthening this tendency. However, it is worth hearing his response, and I'm going to read it because I think it is something I agree with. To assert that race is a subtype of ethnicity, logically as well as historically, is not to deny the brute and brutal reality of racial domination, as feared by activists and scholars who cling to the distinction between race and ethnicity as if their life depends on it. On the contrary, it is to give ourselves the analytic means to discover under what conditions and due to what forces and mechanisms ordinary ethnicity gets turned into racialized ethnicity, and the difference that naturalization makes in different arenas of social action, end quote. To this, I would add that by exposing the imbrication of ethnicity with race, Balkans' model is a most potent way to deconstruct ethnicity, and with this, the untiring quest for origins, the passion, indeed obsession in the Balkans for ethnogenesis, which is so prevalent. It is symptomatic that the acuteness of the debates around race in the Balkans focused almost exclusively on socialist and post-socialist Yugoslavia, and it is produced mostly by sociologists, political scientists, anthropologists, and also by activists. To a historian, their otherwise excellent work reeks of presentism. Again, nothing wrong with it, except when generalizations are retroused on periods these scholars have not studied and have little knowledge of. And I'm going to give an example of the otherwise very welcome and highly overdue Roma studies, where very few are concerned with history. In works on the Balkan Roma, there is a barely concealed idealization of their position in the Ottoman Empire, and phrases like post-Ottoman race-making, post-Ottoman return to race, racial stratification of post-Ottoman populations runs like a mantra in most of these texts. This is regrettable, as looking at the Ottoman documentation, which I have been looking at, the Roma as a group were fully segregated from the other Muslims, forming a group of their own. An unexpected position in Ottoman society where the state played an active role in their marginalization. The poll tax, jizye, was collected from among Muslim gypsies, kaptı, in strict contravention of Quranic law, although the state circumvented the legal problem by levying a poll tax from Muslims by designing a different term. Moreover, their obligation to pay this tax was based on their ethnic origin and not on their religion. In fact, the Roma were relegated to the bottom of society, filling the half nation among dozens of other, as in the old Turkish proverb, in Turkey there are 72.5 nations. 72,5 millet. Rejected by all, never recognized as either true Muslims or true Christians, the Gypsies provided a common negative reference to all components of Ottoman society. Here again, one can perceive the usefulness of racialization from the Balkan model without the formal category race. One can also make an unexpected comparison. Goldberg draws attention to how whites and those deemed not white in the colonies were categorized as European and non-European. The bureaucratic, so both in bureaucratic and popular discourse. Equally, the bureaucratic and popular discourse in the Ottoman Empire categorized its population as Muslims and non-Muslims. One does not have to endorse the poisonous Islamophobia of today, not to approve of the categories of white and Christian nationalism when trying to understand the reasons for the 18th and 19th century Balkan national liberation movements. Hierarchies change. Oop. This is gliding. So let me go back to my own music. Based on the metaphoric use of the notion, in imagining the Balkans, I argued that a specific discourse, Balkanism, molds attitudes and actions toward the Balkans. To put it succinctly, Balkanism expresses the idea that explanatory approaches to phenomena in the Balkans rest upon a stable system of stereotypes that place the Balkans in a cognitive straitjacket. Balkanism was coined both as mirror and foil to Orientalism, to pay both homage to Edward Said and to argue for similarities, but also, distinctive, substantive differences between the two categories. Of course, both of them are discursive formations. Very much like Orientalism, the Balkans serve as a powerful metaphor. Yet the main difference between the two is the geographic and historical concreteness of the Balkans versus the mostly metaphorical and symbolic nature of the Orient. Practically all descriptions of the Balkans offer as a central characteristic their transitionary character. The West and the Orient are usually presented as incompatible entities, anti-world but complete anti-worlds. The Balkans, on the other hand, have always evoked the image of a bridge or a crossroads. Unlike Orientalism, a discourse about an imputed opposition, Balkanism is a discourse about an imputed ambiguity. The lack of colonial predicament of which I spoke for the Balkans also distinguishes the two, as the questions of race, religion, color, language, and gender. The most important distinction, however, is what I perceive as the pull of other essential aspects of the Balkans, which challenge the scholar to deal with the ontology of the region, rather than simply with metaphoric functions, namely its concreteness. Said's Orientalism, of course, was also a very concrete, historically inspired argument, the Palestinian predicament in the era of late imperialism. But it was clad in such a generalizing discourse that it proved to be translatable and became metaphorically appropriate for designating the post-colonial in general. After the Second World War, the designation Balkans all but disappeared, submerged in the bipolar Cold War rhetoric. The stereotypes resurfaced again in the course of a twofold process after 1989. The first was the European Union expansion to the east. Its strategy and costs and the potential competition between candidates resulted in the differential treatment of Eastern Europe's subregions. The Central European ideology of the 1980s evoked the Balkans, Russia and the Balkans, in its constituting, as they are constituting other, by Kundera, and less poisonous by Havel also, but less poisonous by Miłosz and Such. Historically successful, this rhetoric practically disappeared once it achieved its goals. The second coinciding process was Yugoslavia's bloody disintegration. None of the other Balkan countries were ever involved, yet politicians insisted on naming this a third Balkan war, and the blooming of Balkanism actually legitimized the policy of isolation, of non-involvement in the region. This ended with the unintended consequences of the 1999 NATO bombing of Yugoslavia, effectively carried out by the United States. It effectively underwrote the secessionist claims of a minority population and set the stage for Kosovo's full independence some 9 years later, a precedent with unique global repercussions. It became a fundamental departure from the treatment of similar conflicts, like Palestinians and Jews in Israel, Kurds and Turks in Turkey, Kurds and Arabs in Iraq, and others like the Crimea or Spain, where sovereignty and territorial integrity have been the dominant principle. In another respect, the Kosovo War saw the rise of humanitarian hawks and became the dress rehearsal for American unilateralism that culminated in the Second Gulf War. Before, the dominant paradigm applied to the Balkans translated into practical ghettoization. This was Balkanism in action. The rhetorical legitimization of the 1999 intervention as defense of human rights effectively brought the Balkans back into the sphere of Western politics. After the end of the Yugoslav War and after Imagining the Balkans was written, the region is no longer nominally Balkan, except for the absurdity of the Western Balkans, a term that was institutionalized in the Western geopolitical parlance during the Austrian EU presidency in 1998. The rest of the Balkans is effectively part of Europe. In 3 waves, 2004, 7, and 13, Balkan states became EU members, and Albania and the remaining Yugoslav splinters have all been recognized as potential candidates. When in December of last year, 23, accession talks were opened to war-torn Ukraine as well as Moldavia, and candidate status was granted to Georgia, but Bosnia was again delayed, the disappointment and fear that they are left outside because of anti-Muslim bias is growing. When finally, in March of this year, Charles Michel announced the negotiations with Bosnia-Herzegovina with the words, "Congratulations, your place is in our European family," one wonders whether the words of the Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama had reached not only his ears, but also the attention of the European Council. Here is Edi Rama. I wish that Misha would read it. Edi Rama is a huge man, so I'll try to be... I don't want to sound dark here, he said, because the EU is about values and principles, and this is what has created it as a peace project based on the values and principles that Ukraine should be seen like a possible EU member state. But I wish this won't be to the detriment of the Western Balkans. Otherwise, I was looking and thinking, who should attack whom in order to get the EU membership faster together with Ukraine? Bulgaria can attack easily North Macedonia. Croatia can easily attack Serbia. Serbia can easily attack Kosovo. Bosnia can attack itself, no problem. In the meantime, I'm sure that we, Albanians, can ask the Greeks to do us the honor. They will be placed to attack us. Montenegro can play dead on the beach, and this way we can really be ready to join the train with Ukraine. And yet, all of this has been accompanied by the curious but predictable subsiding of the Balkanist rhetoric, though it is still encountered. Even the vocal and often spiteful objections to Turkey's accession focus on Islam, Middle Eastern culture, women's and human rights, but are not clad in the Balkanist rhetoric. Nor was in general Greece's predicament after 2015. Thus, 3 decades after 1990, while the rhetoric is still with us, conveniently submerged, but readily at hand, it no longer serves power politics. Balkanism has not disappeared, but has shifted from the center stage of politics. Even Balkanization is beginning to shed its poisonous darts, although it continues to be used disparagingly for any fragmentation, and it is applied to any social splintering along ethnic, racial, even gender and sexual lines. Multiculturalism has been equated with Balkanization. It is the name for excessive specialization, a metaphor for postmodernism and post-communism. It is applied to demography, education, mathematics, international law, the global financial market, academia, digital health, news media, the internet, literature, poetry, and the arts. Semantically, Balkanization has reached an abstract level, disengaged from its territorial origins and becoming innocent, much like the notion of Byzantine, which is a 16th century neologism used to designate a specific art form and applied retrospectively to a historical entity, the Eastern Roman Empire, which never called itself Byzantine. It became a synonym for overly complicated, scheming, intriguing, and hypocritical. While clearly alluding to an existing entity within the historical knowledge of the educated public, it still refers to something that has gone down in history. Another example is bugger, a term for sodomite, as well as an offensive form of address, which comes from the medieval heretics in Provence, the bougre, deriving their name from the Bulgarians, among whom the medieval Christian dualist Bogomil heresy was first formed, and who spread it to Western Europe. By now it is so far removed, both in name and in time, from its beginnings, that only an intrepid scholar would trace its geographic origins, and Bulgarians are not offended, they're even using it. So if I'm correct in arguing that the Balkans as a geopolitical signifier is gradually disappearing or only surviving in certain linguistic remnants, decoupled from its ontological existence, does this mean that the region or the attitudes toward it have disappeared too? Clearly not. In 2003, the Slovenian philosopher Rastko Močnik wrote, quote, "There are two parameters that remain stable across the Balkan countries. Poverty is increasing and inequality is increasing," end quote. Another 2 decades, poverty and inequality are still there, even if they're not confined to the Balkans, but are global. A trend, as Thomas Piketty reminds us, and no one is happy with it. To my knowledge, though, there is only one Balkan country on which poverty is used as stigma. The poorest country of the European Union is the adjective accompanying Bulgaria, even when the news is about tourism, music, or cuisine. It is not a Balkan country, but the poorest country. Is poverty better, worse, or the same as Balkan? Poverty has institutional, economic, and psychological dimensions. It also reflects on immigration policy. The reservations about Romania and Bulgaria's Schengen access are primarily triggered by concern over the influx of North African and Syrian refugees from Greece, which has no land connection for the rest of the Schengen space. This not only costs more to the economically poor southeastern periphery of the European Union, but it is relegated, as often in its history, to a geopolitical and epistemic buffer zone that often withstands pressure from the Western core. The Balkanist rhetoric is altogether still slumbering, hidden off by the conventions of politically correct speech and finding different rhetorical outlets. So maybe this moment of relative calm may allow us to reflect more calmly on the scholarly project of making sense of the Balkans, which would be a nice segue to my next lecture on measuring the Balkans. The Balkans, I'm concluding here, they can be approached through a scholarly category of analysis, the notion of historical legacy, which is intimately intertwined with the character of the Balkans as a concrete historical, not simply geographic region, that is, as a space-time entity. By elevating historical legacy as the heuristic concept to understand the Balkans, the gist of my argument is that only characteristics present in the later stages of the existence of an entity are handed down as legacy immediately after its collapse, and with time they fade away but can persist as perception. I think that thus I indicated the mechanism of change and transformation of continuities. Thinking in terms of historical legacies characterized by simultaneous, overlapping, and gradually waning effects allows us to emphasize the complexity and plasticity of the historical process. In the case of the Balkans, it allows us to rescue the region from a debilitating diachronic and spatial ghettoization and insert it into a multifarious cognitive framework over space and time. Europe itself, of course, in this vision emerges as a complex palimpsest of differently shaped entities, which not only expose the porosity of external frontiers, but also questions the absolute stability of internal ones. In this respect, the task for Balkanists consists not so much of provincializing Europe, but of provincializing Western Europe, which has heretofore expropriated the category of Europe with concrete political and moral consequences, despite the official pledges for a united and equitable entity. If this project is successful, we will actually accomplish a broadening of Europe to include not only a cleansed abstract ideal of values and a version of power, but also one of dependency, subordination, messy struggles, and solidarity. But for that, we should avoid strictures, not only vis-à-vis the Balkans and Eastern Europe at large, but also vis-à-vis internal criticism. We need a Gadamerian understanding, which means that I'm able to weigh and consider fairly what the other person thinks. It means that one recognizes that the other person could be right in what he or she says, or actually wants to say. Thank you. Oh, okay. I'm coming. Oop. Okay.
Thank you, Maria. There are a whole range of issues that we can address after that. You made me think when you were talking about the Roma in the Balkans and this concept of the half nation, which I think is really a fascinating concept. It's a concept and an attitude which appears to have bridged the collapse of the Ottoman Empire and continues to exist to this day in many Balkan nations. And I would like to get your take on contrasting that with attitudes to Jewish populations in the Balkans, who were, of course, a very well-established and ordered part of the Ottoman polity, being one of the three peoples of the book, and therefore with certain rights, privileges, and so on. Would it be fair to say that in post-Ottoman areas of the Balkans, I want to exclude Croatia from this discussion, that a certain recognition of Jewish populations that existed in the Ottoman Empire was also carried over in the way that the attitudes to the Roma were carried over into the nation states as they emerged?
That has been an argument which has been made, and I myself have made it, but I think it would go even deeper than that. You have had Romaniot, Jewish population, even before the Ottomans, which was well integrated both in the Byzantine Empire and in the Serbian and Bulgarian medieval states. Yeah. So yes, the Ottoman Empire, in some ways, the Ottoman Empire took maybe this legacy and strengthened it, but it is true that the Jewish population has been embraced, if you like, more than so there has not been a racist attitude, except for the interwar period, when very often it was imposed from the outside because of geopolitical considerations. Okay. It has to do, of course, with the way of life. The half population, in the ranking of the Ottoman Empire, the nomads are the lowest, so you are nomadic, you are not settled, and plus you are phenotypically different. You're recognizable, and speak a different language from the Turkic-speaking nomads, the Yuruk, for example, who had been embraced by the Ottomans. So it has to do with the way of life, of course, the station of life.
For example, in the Second World War, with Bulgaria's decision, I mean, to some extent, a pragmatic decision not to deport the Jewish population of Bulgaria proper, leave aside what happened in Western Bulgaria, Macedonia, Skopje, etc. Do you think that there was an element of echoes of that there, or was that Tsar Boris being completely political?
First of all, I don't think that there are some even in Israel who like Tsar Boris. I don't think it's Tsar Boris. There was a pressure, mostly from the Orthodox Church. You know, the Metropolitan Maxim had said that he would go with the Jews. So you had a pressure from the public sphere. Obviously, the left was coming out, but also the church and the population at large. For Boris, it was a calculated move, absolutely, but the rest was
within the population.
There was a real outroar about saving the Jews, not the Macedonian Jews. This is something that Bulgarians have to live with, and the nationalists are trying to deny it. But it is a fact that the Bulgarian Jews were,
or at the very least, they don't mention it as as actually having happened.
Having said that, they were still deported from the big cities. So there was this law for the defense of the nation, which clearly segregated them, but not to the point of annihilating them.
You also mentioned at one point that there is this obsession with ethnogenesis. Where do you think that obsession comes from? Is that simply the struggle for supremacy between national groups after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire?
Yeah, I think so. Who comes first? It's a territorial obsession. Who was there first? And also a matter of hierarchies. The Greeks have it very well. They are the classical nation. So everybody is measuring themselves vis-a-vis the Greeks. The Bulgarian embraced Thracianness, the Romanians Dacianness. So they are earlier than the Greeks, right? So you have this thing of who is first in the peninsula, who contributed most to the culture. It's entirely nationalist competition.
How much have your positions changed since the first publication of Imagining the Balkans? Do you see an evolution in your thought about Balkanism, or do you feel as though the past 30 years have generally vindicated your perception?
I mean, I have to tell you that after I wrote it, I was so fed up with it, but I was not looking back at it, although I did a second edition where I added things. After that, I was very upset that each time I was going somewhere, I was imagining the Balkans. So I really hated it. I don't think, whatever I said here, the evolution is that it is confined. The stereotyping of the region is there, but it has another rhetorical outlet. Balkanism still exists, but not in this. It doesn't serve a political goal as it did serve during the Yugoslav wars about ghettoizing the Balkans. The Balkans should not be part of Europe. So I can quote a lot of people, your friends among them, Timothy Gartnash. Bring the Central Europeans in. The Balkans should be out. Right.
That was the Visegrad strategy that you referred to. I thought, I remember at the time that this was actually a conscious strategy of Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Poland. I think that I think there still is there is an attempt to isolate the Balkans. One of the areas where I think Balkanism is very present is in the whole discourse about organized crime, which is something that I've written about. The Albanians feel this very, very keenly. They feel as though the primary perception of Albania these days is the generation of organized criminal groups, and that somehow Balkan criminality is generating the sort of decline and degeneration of European society outside, that it's an active agent, as it were, as opposed to responding to the normal laws of supply and demand, and in particular the demand for criminal services in Western and Northern Europe.
No, absolutely. I think this is part of Balkanism. But you know very well that, first of all, there is no Balkan mafia. You're the specialist, of course, on mafia, but there is no Balkan mafia. In fact, there was a wonderful article during the summer on Montenegro in the
in the LRB, in the London Review of Books. I highly recommend this by a young journalist called Alexander Clapp, and it's one of the
it's excellent.
So best pieces.
You have two villages. You have two tribes which are the criminals. You call it Balkan mafia. It uses some networks in the former Yugoslavia, obviously, because this is where they lived. But it is not a Balkan mafia, and mostly what they're using is, you know, the crimes from Latin America. They are the conduits of Latin American.
Exactly.
So yeah.
So, but I like your point that Balkanization has actually detached itself from the geographical area. The phrase that I come across Balkanization most frequently about these days is the Balkanization of the internet, which started about 10 years ago. And of course, most people who use this have absolutely no idea what it's referring to. But in that sense, that's quite a good thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I told you, bugger is a nice word. You know?
Yeah, exactly, the detachment. Although bugger's not a word you can use in normal parlance in the United Kingdom, but that's a separate issue. Great. I'd like to throw it open to the floor for questions for Maria. Yorgos. Can you wait for the microphone?
Thanks very much for a wonderful lecture. I was thinking while you were, by then, I've lived in the United Kingdom for many years and have been always passionately keen on the European Union debates in the country. 10 countries joined the European Union in 2004, as you know, with the exception of 2 small Mediterranean islands, all of them from the former communist world. The fuss that was made a few years later, because Bulgaria and Romania were joining, was 10 times more than the objections to the 10.
Right.
So I was wondering if you have any comments. It arguably led to Brexit. The fuss that was made, I mean, many things led to Brexit, but the thing that spilled the... anyway, I can't argue, I haven't done research. All I'm saying is I remember how there was so much more in the press, in the yellow press, than in 2004. No,
absolutely. I mean, look, we are guilty for Brexit too, you know. It's Bulgaria and Romania. So, no, but you're absolutely right. So not only was there in the press, but actually the conditions that were laid to Romania and Bulgaria were much harsher than the ones that were given to the other newcomers to the European Union, as the ones that are now in front of the newcomers, you know, North Macedonia, Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, they're also higher and higher. So the hindrances are bigger and bigger. And in fact, the European Union was trying to take them piecemeal. The fact that Romania and Bulgaria went in a package was actually because they insisted to go in a package. The European Union wanted to do it piecemeal because it is easier to, you know, to break down, you know, the negotiating power of whoever wants to accede. But now they are doing it with Albania and North Macedonia.
If I may abuse the fact that I hold this, the day of the referendum in the morning before I went to vote, on my Facebook, an Albanian flag hit me. You open the page and it says, Albania is about to join the European Union. See what this means for you.
Wow.
So the Brexit propaganda was using that.
Yeah.
Yes, well, I wish that was true, that Albania was about to join the European Union, but I can assure the purveyors of that advertisement that they're not. Any other questions? It appears, Maria, for the... Oh, Philip.
Nobody's asking. Also, we'll have the pleasure next week. My question is a little bit geared towards switching the perspective in two regards. One is, you know, when you mentioned the Brexit, it came back to my mind that in the British media there was always this talk about Europe on the other side of the channel. Now, that is known also in Russia, right? Still in Ukraine, interestingly enough, this essentialization of Europe as being somewhere else. And I just wonder, did actually the changed configuration after 2004 or then 2007 have an impact about the linguistic discourse, the geography, you know, is that still happening? Okay, we're going to Europe, or since when in general did this switch? And the second question related to that is, you mentioned, of course in your book there's much more, but now in your talk you mentioned basically one person from the Balkans, Bošković, the usual hero, also in many books. And so I wonder about the contribution of intellectuals in the regions or in the region or from the region to all that, and how your perception of their role might have changed over time. So what is their role in this, especially, you know, taking up stereotypes like, okay, backwardness, which is, well, the standard argument for introducing reforms, and, or, you know, fighting poverty. So, you know, there's so many ways how they got engaged in this process, isn't there? And if so, how?
Right. I mean, to the first question, I think that returning to Europe was also a rhetorical thing. This is, we want to be part of this. The moment these countries, you know, I'm talking Romania, Bulgaria, Croatia, went into Europe, I think this has, you know, this has ended. There is a disillusion, which is not the same as saying that they are Eurosceptical or they want to go out of Europe, but they no longer hold Europe as this place of values and idealism, which is the case still in the Ukraine, less so in Russia, I think. But in the Ukraine, it is. Of course, the political leadership is speaking this language, but the population is very disappointed with Europe. But not to the point where it wants to leave Europe. So it's not that. But of course, you know, you have the idea was that communism was a corrupt system, and after the fall of communism, corruption is rising. Why is that, right? So this is where people are in general. So I don't think that the illusions of Europe as this you know, mythical lighting rod that's gone. As far as you know, Balkan intellectuals, I mean, Bošković did not consider himself Balkan. He thought of himself as cosmopolitan, right? He was a Jesuit priest. So I think that the moment you say Balkan intellectual, you are already ghettoizing them in being Balkan, right? So they are intellectuals. Well, who speaks about Hegel as a philosopher necessarily from Germany? He's a Western philosopher, right? You know, he's a European philosopher, right? So, this geographic boundedness is done only for marked categories, right? You have Europeans in general, European intellectuals in general. You don't have necessarily Northwest European intellectuals, Southwest European intellectuals, Northeast European intellectuals, but you have Southeast European intellectuals. Why? Because Southeastern Europe is a market category, right? Within this framework where Europe is the central category which is hegemonic, right?
I think the process of applying for membership of the European Union has actually clarified things for a lot of people in the Balkans. They feel themselves self-evidently European, and the process of trying to join the European Union is something else. The European Union does not mean Europe to them. It means the European Union, a political construct. Right. They never stop feeling European, in my experience, whether you're in Tirana or Sofia or Sarajevo. Adam.
But there is, of course, always the self-disparaging remarks. We are European, but not quite so. So you have that in the talks of Balkan people also, right?
Actually, that's a perfect segue for the question that I had. You mentioned Said's Orientalism earlier. One of Said's arguments in that book is that Orientalism becomes such a powerful discursive formation that people in the region begin to internalize some of its premises and to engage even in a kind of flamboyant self-orientalization. And you talk mostly about the external imposition of the category of Balkan and Balkanization. So I'm wondering if you could talk a bit about whether and how people in the Balkans have themselves engaged in a self-Balkanizing discourse.
Very strongly so. There are people who are speaking of self-colonization. My friend Alexander Kyosif. So it is very much internalized. What happens though, what happened after 1989 is the discovery of the Balkans by themselves, the discovery of the neighbors for the first time. Before all these countries, before the end of the 80s, were looking at the West, Greece, to England mostly, Turkey, or to France and whatnot. Now they're looking at the yard next door. They are equating, there is a kind of a rising komşuluk, if you like, between these people. And it is very much obvious among people of the arts, so people in literature, writers, artists that are coming together in the Balkans. A distinction, there is also not only the self-Balkanizing, there is also the self-orientalizing, and my friend Milica Bakic-Hayden has written about nesting Orientalism. Everyone who is further to the east is more Oriental, right? So you Orientalize people also within. But there is also a very, very important thing in what Said did is he was arguing that scholarship about the Orient is basically almost guilty in creating this thing. The thing is that Balkan scholarship arose not from the outside, but inside the Balkans. And this is actually a very interesting thing that I'm writing in the second part of the book, but I'm not going to talk about. So it is an internal phenomenon. It starts with after the secession of these Balkan states, and of course they are competitive, they are hostile to each other, but the intellectual classes, especially in literature and history, are looking at each other and are finding commonalities. And it starts from within. So the discipline of Balkan studies is, in fact, an internal thing, very much also helped, in particular in Bosnia, by the Germans, but in Bulgaria and Romania and the other countries, it is actually coming bottom up, if you like. So that makes a huge difference, because they don't scholarship even when it self-Balkanizes, is different from the self-orientalization of Said's Orientalism. So mostly in the Balkan disciplines, it was the overcoming of this orientalization of the Ottoman Empire, and in scholarship that has already occurred. That's no longer the case. Of course, in journalism, in popular speech, it's still there, but in scholarship, it's gone. That has been overcome.
Yeah, and then there's a hand at the back as well.
Good evening. Thank you so much for this insightful lecture. I'm Milan Gajic. I'm coming from Serbia, and I'm a master's student at Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. I have two very short questions. First one is, do you see any linkages between Kosovo case and Crimea case, and later on what happened in Ukraine and is still happening? And the second question is about Yugoslav war, especially between Serbia and Croatia. Do you think that that war is result of what happened in independent state of Croatia in the Second World War? Thank you.
Over to you. I'm glad I'm not answering that question.
Well, I mean, I said, obviously, I do think that the Kosovo War had implications for Crimea. Although, of course, this is also the argumentation of Putin. But I think that it does have. It is correct that it has have the implications, because these are two, of course, different criteria. On the one hand, you fight for self-determination. On the other hand, you don't allow self-determination and elevate the principle of territorial integrity and sovereignty of the state as completely saintly. So yes, these are hypocritical attitudes, right? No, I don't think, obviously, Tudjman was using that, but I don't think that is what created the war between Serbia and Croatia. I mean, the reasons are very, very complex, and there are wonderful books written about and so Susan Woodward, I like very much, and Misha Glenny has written wonderful on the disintegration of Yugoslavia. So please read him and Susan Woodward. We agree that these are probably the best books on the economic and then political disintegration of Yugoslavia. What you're saying is part of the story, but it's not all the part. So in some ways, your question was somehow unidirectional, monocausal. So. But you're right, there is also that.
At the back, there was a question.
Yes, Maria, thank you so much for this wonderful lecture. I wanted to go back to your comments on race and racialization, and in particular on Loïc Falcon's work on what he calls the diagonal of racialization, his desire to treat race as a subtype of ethnicity, as you absolutely rightly point out. For him, this is absolutely not a way of diminishing the significance of racial domination, quite the contrary. But you highlight in particular this notion of the movement along this so-called diagonal from less racialized forms of ethnicity to more racialized, that is thicker, more rigid, based more in imputations about the body and so on. So what I wanted to hear you draw out a little bit more is how this notion of shifts over time in degree of racialization would apply to the Balkans. You mentioned quickly one or two examples, but I wondered if you could just draw that out a little bit more.
Well, I think that this particular case of thick, racialized ethnicity applies only to the Roma. I don't think it applies in the case of interwar period with the Jews. It applies only in the governmental rhetoric, but not in popular perceptions and discourse. With the Roma, it is dangerous. It is very much within the public sphere. Baker, in fact, is citing you as someone who is still keeping race apart from ethnicity. I mean, I don't know. Have you changed your mind about Vacan? I thought that what he allows to do is precisely this shifting. It can go down, but it can go up again. So you can de-racialize ethnicity, if you wish. So this is where I find his model very beautifully dynamic, and it can happen. It can happen with the Roma. In fact, it does happen with the Roma, and there are examples of Roma who are educated, become important intellectuals, and all of a sudden you forget that they are Roma. Just like with the with the blacks in the United States. It's the social mobility which allows for this de-racialization of ethnicity. But to me that was actually pretty interesting, because in the Yugoslav case the insistence of racism, I might be wrong, but my impression is that it came with a new generation which is very angry at people who are looking at some of the positive sides of Yugoslavia, particularly the non-aligned movement, NAM, which is somehow being the complementary thing about Yugoslavia. And they insist on showing that no, it is racist. There is nothing redeeming about this period. So the conflict. This is why I say that the conflict is mostly within Yugoslavia, because they are still bleeding from the war. In the other countries, it is not that. It is not. You would expect that it would be more. It would be more alive in Romania and Bulgaria, where we do have a substantial, Roma population. But it is not. It is not argued within the intellectual circles. That is taken for granted somehow.
Ilya.
Could you please elaborate on Balkanism in Russia and Turkey? To what extent does it exist? And if at all, does it exist in different modulations than the Western Balkanism?
I don't think Turkey. Turkey is rather the subject of Balkanism rather than the object of Balkanism rather than the subject of Balkanism. And if anything, in Turkey there is a beautified, not to say beatified, perception of the Balkans. So there is a very positive attitude toward the Balkans. In the Russian case, I mean, I've written about Russia. It's not a Balkanism thing. It is the Big Brother thing. It is orthodoxy more than Balkanism. So Balkanism becomes stronger the more you go further from the Balkans. The neighboring empires, for them, the Balkans were part of their realm of influence. So I remember when I wrote Imagining the Balkans, I had a very nice friend, a Jewish friend, a colleague who said, you're letting the Germans too easily off. You are mostly arguing against the British. I said, the British are far away. And they are the most prejudiced because they are far away. The nearer you come, the more you understand. So within the German language perceptions, you have more understanding. The Russian perceptions too. So in Russia, you don't have this type of Balkanism. The one argument that I heard by a Russian who was listening to me years ago was, but Balkanism is actually a category of linguistics. He was a linguist, right? Balkanism is this category which tells you of similar
characteristics across language groups.
Yeah, so you have the Balkan Linguistic Union, the Sprachbund, and that is Balkanism. But it was a relatively uninhabited category, only linguists knew it. So I borrowed it from them and use it for my metaphorical discourse of Balkanism. I don't know whether that helps, but yeah.
That might also explain why when Vesna Goldsworthy wrote Inventing Ruritania, she primarily looks at English literature, English and Scottish and Irish literature because,
the French too. The French were so enamored of the Ottoman Empire that they were also stereotyping the Balkans because they felt that, you know, empires like other empires. So both the British and the French liked the Ottoman
Ottomans,
Empire.
yeah. I think we've got time for one more question over here, which is...
Thank you, Maria, for a very articulate presentation covering a great deal of territory. I would like to return to an early reference, though, to the magic, the literary magic, and the culture of Illyria. And wonder, rather than shifting to politics and economics, as we have mostly done in the question period, to reference a couple of more current authors, someone like Milorad Pavic in Landscape Painted with Tea, in which he takes a very interesting trajectory on the origin of the Balkan monasteries and their influence, or in his text, The Dictionary of the Khazars, which may in fact, and to the linguistic reference, but may in fact be one of the first and most eloquent discussions of gender. And how do you see, I think, the literature of the area continuing to express the richness of the culture? Thank you.
No, absolutely. Yeah. So in fact, you are answering the question that Philip was asking about intellectuals in the Balkans. Yes, the literature is great. The literature is great. It is self-confined because of language. You have to translate literature, and only then can it be seen. So some of these people are translated. Some are difficult to translate, and they are not the intrepid translators who would dare do it. So I know mostly the Bulgarian literature, and it takes almost a political effort to push for writers from the region. But that's a predicament for any literature nowadays, which doesn't have a big clientele demographically, and with the hegemony of English, that's a fact. Yeah. But yes, thank you.
Well, it only remains for me to remind you that if you'd like a glass of wine or a glass of water and to carry on the conversation now, you're more than welcome to do so. But before we do that, a big round of applause, please, for Maria Todorova.